Good afternoon. Arthur Probe reporting on a surprising development. Famed California inventor Patrick Quilter has been missing for several days. We have our hard-hitting field reporter, Anita Hammer, standing in front of Quilter Labs.
Thank you, Arthur. We're here at Quilter Guitar Amplifiers, where the investigation is in full swing. Authorities have yet to release any information, but earlier we were able to get a KQOC exclusive interview with the company's CEO, Chris Parks.
We're not completely sure what happened ourselves. He's been missing for a few days. We have some security camera footage from the lab and from the parking lot area, which I can share with you.
This footage taken last weekend shows Pat Quilter removing what appears to be a cell phone from a copper-lined chamber. According to Quilter Guitar Amplifier employees, he uses this chamber for experiments in high-frequency radiation testing. This next scene from the external security camera has caused some controversy here with investigators. The vehicle has been identified as a K200 Messerschmitt cycle car, an obscure German austerity car produced after World War II. Experts agree it could never attain the incredible rate of speed you are about to witness, nor could anyone explain the strange optical effects that follow.
We've searched the lab, we've contacted family members. No one's seen or heard anything from him in a few days. The only clue that we have is he's got a bunch of equations scribbled down with the letter T. They all end in the letter T.
Thank you, Mr. Parks. Reporting live from Costa Mesa, this is Anita Hammer, KQOC 8.
Thank you, Anita. Of course, high school students nationwide are now checking their physics textbooks for the meaning of the symbol T. Viewers with any tips are requested to call the Missing Persons Hotline at 714-773-2681. Coming up, are you a gross polluter? What's coming out of your tailpipe? About controversial new biohazard after the break. Arthur Probe reporting, and we have Chris Parks, CEO of Quilter Labs, here with us in the studio to give us the latest update on the mysterious disappearance of Pat Quilter. Chris, I have to be honest, there's a lot of controversy surrounding last week's developments. So, how serious is this really?
I need you to know we're very seriously looking for Pat, and things are even weirder now. If you can, roll the footage. So we were experimenting with our cell phone camera in the lab when three nice old ladies came up to the front door, which isn't really all that unusual. We're called Quilter Guitar Amplifiers, and usually they'll ask if we sell quilting supplies. But these ladies asked if Pat was there. And then they proceeded to hand me this canister of film marked Covina Sisters 1957. And then they just took off before I could ask them anything else and told us to make sure that Pat sees it as soon as possible. I gotta find a film projector. Oh, okay, go ahead and roll the next clip. Okay, so we dug out an old 16mm film projector that Pat had in his office. And at first we were thinking someone had just given him some old fan movie or something from the 50s. And we were starting to admire these three girls when all of a sudden, okay, there, right there. So there's Pat. Of course we were thinking, yeah, it's some sort of practical joke, or maybe Pat had this made up to play some sort of April Fool's joke on us. But the film is faded. It's worn out. It's obviously very, very old. The thing is, when we turned this over to the investigators, they just blew us off. And they just told us, well, you guys are playing an elaborate hoax on everyone. But no one can explain how his image is on this vintage 16mm Kodachrome movie. This sort of film isn't even made anymore. How is this even possible? I guess that's all there is. We're in a complete loss. This film is obviously very old, but there's an image of Pat looking exactly like he did when he disappeared on March 9th.
Well, I'm sure our top government investigators will soon get to the bottom of this mystery.
You said you were going to help. You know what? I'm done. I don't have time for this. We got to find Pat.
Okay, and now this. What's really in your dog food? This is Arthur Probe, and we're back in the studio with Chris Parks, who's got the latest astonishing developments in the Pat Quilter case. What can you tell us, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. Well, the good news is that Pat's back. He's been on an amazing journey. You're never going to believe the footage that we have to show you. Pat came knocking on the door yesterday. He was looking like hell.
Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us what happened, and we'll roll the footage.
Okay, so here's Pat at the front door. I let him in. He looked like he was getting ready to collapse, but he kept on yelling about his cell phone. Get a charger! Get a charger! I looked around, I grabbed the nearest one. We got it plugged in. And as soon as his phone came on, he punched up some images, looked incredibly relieved, and then kind of passed out on the couch. This gave us some time to get a camera together so we could document his eyewitness report.
Quilter Labs has provided us with this exclusive footage showing Pat Quilter's first statements after his almost unbelievable journey.
So, is the camera running?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was completing the development of the Aviator, but there was just one more hurdle I had to overcome. I had to demonstrate that the tone I'd achieved was equal to the best tone ever recorded in history. Now all authorities agreed. In this obscure cafe east of San Diego on December 7th, 1957, a little three-piece trio took off and performed one of the most outstanding sets of guitar tone ever heard. Of course, nobody was there with a tape recorder, but that's the way everyone remembers it. Well, there was only one thing I could do. I had to invent a time machine that would take me and a prototype back to 1957 so I could compare the tone for myself. Well, thanks to some little-known work in the sci-fi community, the time equations were really not that difficult, and eventually I was able to generate some computer code that would actually run as a cell phone app. So after all, this little gadget has more computing power than the entire free world of 1957. However, my improvised time machine had limited capacity, so I used my smallest microcar as the transporter. I wasn't quite prepared for the spin-dizzy side effects, but I pulled myself together and managed to get the car started and wobbled my way out onto the highway. Felt like maybe a front wheel got bent during the transition. Well, the roads in 1957 were narrow, and I had to baby the car, and the trip took a little longer than I figured. But at least there wasn't much traffic out in the country. So I puttered along as best I could, leaving a nice trail of unburned hydrocarbons, and finally reached the club near sundown. I pulled into the outskirts of the parking lot in time to catch the end of the first set. I grabbed the amp out of the back seat, remembered to turn the lights off. Well, going into the club, I couldn't help noticing an awesome display of serious 50s iron. Wow, they had cars back then. Well, I could see the joint was jumping, so I discreetly slipped in the back and grabbed some quick shots to document this legendary performance. Well, frankly, you couldn't really hear the band that well, so I chatted them up during the break. They were playing great, but you just couldn't hear them. So I brought out the Aviator prototype and asked if they were willing to give it a try. Well, they were a little skeptical, but they agreed to use it on the next set. I set it up in front of their old amp, swapped over the cables, fired that mother up. It was awesome! The sound was coming through loud and clear, and the kids went wild. I didn't know they had dancing like that in the 50s, so I grabbed a few more shots for posterity. Well, all good things must come to an end. But their mood during the second break was a lot more upbeat. I was sure proud to see how well they did with the Aviator, and I couldn't stop congratulating them. Of Of course, I also had to tell him that I couldn't leave the amp with him. After all, it would have changed history as we know it. To get him to understand, I finally had to convince him I was a top secret government scientist researching UFO technology to get America back in the space race. I clinched my cover story by showing him my secret tricorder device. They compared the live color recordings to their clunky TV and finally seemed to buy my story. I guess the appeal to national security struck home, and after due consideration they agreed to let me go. Although the guitar player made one final appeal and offered to trade his year-old Chevy Nomad straight across for the Aviator. Believe me, it was a tempting offer, but I had to refuse. I needed to get back to my own time, and the Spin Dizzy could never handle a big American car like that. Now you see, the thing about the time machine is I had to get back to the exact same location at the exact same time of day, so the solar flux and the temporal flux would align precisely. And after a rather restless night in my cramped vehicle, I fired up my cell phone to get the coordinates back to the drop zone. Oh, the world's smartest guy forgot. There was no GPS in 1957. What was I going to do? Come on, brain. I got it. Airplane pilots. They have accurate charts and navigational instruments. So once again I hit the road looking for the nearest airport. Pressing the Messerschmitt to the max, I could only hope that wobbly front tire would stay in place long enough to make it. Finally, a likely-looking sign came into view, and I pulled in. Well, there, much to my surprise, I encountered three lovely young ladies doing some kind of publicity shoot. They turned out to be the Covina sisters. Well, I had a little time to kill, so we fooled around during their break and had a fine old time. But my deadline was approaching, so I sweet-talked a nearby pilot into finding my coordinates. I had to feed him a line about representing a Hollywood studio looking for stunt pilots. If he could find my drop zone and fly me there, he'd get the job. He finally agreed he could fly me to an open field near my location. I told the girls I'd be back to get the Messerschmitt as soon as I could, waved goodbye to my new friends, and climbed into the airplane, hoping I'd make it to the location in time. Obviously, I made it back to the drop zone, even if my calculations were a couple of weeks off. But I caught that legendary performance on my cell phone. Of course, there's just one question. Was this legendary tone session before or after we switched to the Aviator?
Well, I guess that'll be up to our viewers to decide. So go over to www.quilterlabs.com and cast your ballot.
Well, after the dust finally settled, we found an address on the back of the card that was taped to our film canister, which took us to a little bungalow in the older section of Covina. And here we met the three Covina sisters, still alive and rockin'. They welcomed us in and poured us a nice cup of tea while we talked about that strange encounter over 50 years ago. Then they took us to their little garage, where they showed us something they'd kept safe for all these years. At first we thought it was just the props from that old photo shoot they'd done, but then we started to pull the blankets off this mysterious pile of junk in the back, and we couldn't believe our eyes. It was Pat's old Messerschmitt! Unbelievable! Well, what can you say after something like that but thanks? Thanks to everyone for helping us look for Pat. Well, or at least thanks for helping us look for his marbles. We can't believe how much love and support we've been shown. Isn't life amazing? And thanks to you for joining us on our never-ending quest for great tone.
Really? This guy's for real? Where do you find these people?
Arthur Pro can suck it!